All right. So finally back. As an update, the reason that these live reads were supposed to be done at in the month of October, but as some people who have been following or in the Facebook group or the newsletter know, my wife and I had our first child in September, so things have been a little busy with that and with teaching at the prep school that I work at. So I haven't been able to keep up with my uh, live reading schedule. So what ended up happening is that we got stuck without getting the final episode up when it was supposed to for the sword. But I've got it now, and I'm going to be doing the last 30 pages or so today, which will probably take around an hour or so. I'll try to do a recap before that, but just so people know, you'll notice there's a new uh, bit of an artwork addition to the spine of the books. They now have Roman numerals so that on a shelf you can distinguish which is book 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And also, this book, this version, which is the third edition of the sword, now has a massive amount of edits and changes and tweaks to perfect it down to what I think is probably going to remain the final version unless there's some tiny modifications later. But after going through it, found a few more grammatical issues that needed to get fixed from the first one and tweaked all that stuff. So because the first one was the product of a sort of collaboration in terms of editing with myself and a few other people who are not professional editors, we had to go through a few different versions to correct it. So if you have a first or second edition, you probably have one that has a couple of errors in it, but you also have one that no longer exists. So I don't know if that's more valuable to you or not. The new ones, as far as I can tell, are completely corrected, and the Shield, which was professionally edited by a friend's mother, who is a former, now retired editor, as far as I can tell from reading through it, doesn't have any glaring. I didn't notice any errors. That doesn't mean that there aren't some in there that someone with a more capable eye would have caught, but that's where we're at. So we'll be finishing, starting with chapter 29 today. As far as the plot lines and where things are at this stage, Edge and Raymir and Romand have been cornered by Saltillion at the top of Mount Iceblade. Trem has been caught under the ground in the home of Sunhall, the dwarves, which turn out to not be dwarves, but in fact be something much more nefarious, and is now in significant endangerment to his life. And back in Angladeus, Lena Engrove was killed by Vendile, who was in turn killed by Varasho Hawking, or Varasho Angladeus, the brother of Lena's paramour, Logan, who is currently with Trem and the others, who are heading south towards Southron. So we're wrapping up all of these threads of plot. There is a epilogue that I will read at the end of this, so there's going to be 2 chapters and then an epilogue. I may take a break in between there, and depending on where he's at, I may introduce Caleb to the stream at the end so everybody can see what's been keeping me away from reading for a while. And at the end of the stream, I'm also going to talk about kind of what's going to happen next. I am going to live read The Shield, which will take longer. It's a longer book. But I'm also planning on doing something pretty cool in between with one of the people that helped collaborate on this. So here we go, chapter 29. Saltillion's eyes remained locked on Edge as he lurched closer, his body moving in a halting, jerking mimicry of walking. Raymir was screaming and her every muscle was stretched taut, yet she could not move to assist him. Edge's eyes remained focused on the mage as he slid close to him, looking his victim up and down as he relished his victory. Edge snarled through barely moving lips at Saltillion, but he could not manage to work his tongue. The mad wizard grasped his face with clawed and bleeding fingers. No talking yet, no. The pain I will cause will make you strong enough to speak, though I do doubt we will understand your words. Edge strained his arms, but could not move them against the power of Saltillion's spell. His lisp was gone, his voice changed, something had possessed the wizard, though Edge could not say what. The mage had given himself over to some strange power, and nothing the lost elf did was enough to stop his horrific triumph. Saltillion pulled a thin, curved knife from his robes and held it to Edge's face. We should begin, I think, with those magnificent eyes of yours. Roman had been next to Edge, held as he and Raymir were, but the focus of Saltillion was lessened on him as the wizard began to gloat. The others were the prizes, Roman was just a witness. But as the shell of former humanity before him reached out to torture Edge in front of Raymir, the man from Hethagar could contain himself no longer. Roman wrenched at his invisible bonds and found them loose. With a desperate lunge, he hurled himself awkwardly towards Saltillion, and the power holding him broke. The mage's reaction was swifter than the stumbling assault. He whirled to face the desperate older man and extended his hand. A beam of white heat lanced from the wand he held, smashing into Roman's body and hurling him to the snowy ground. Saltillion turned back to his other prisoners and froze. Edge's fearsome axe blade protruded from Saltillion's skull. He'd been freed by Roman's distraction, and with his one chance, he struck true as Wolfbane had trained him. The maddened eyes rolled back in Saltillion's broken head, and he slumped into the snow. Raymir rushed past Edge to Roman's huddled form, now looking so small and frail in the cold snow. The older man raised his hand in warning and slung his cloak over his chest. "No closer, child. Nothing for you to see here." Raymir tried to move forward, but Edge held her shoulder. "No," was all he said. Roman propped himself up on his right arm, away from where Saltillion had struck him. His breathing was labored and his skin white as the carpet of flakes about him, but still he smiled. "Are you both wearing those long faces for me? Come now, I'm well past 9 lives." He coughed and grimaced. This was bound to happen. "Let me see the wound, Roman. I can try to heal." A sharp shake of his head cut Raymir off, and his voice, now ragged, came sternly towards her. "There's nothing left of me there to heal. Look at him. He knows." Raymir followed Edge's eyes, which stared stoically at the unnatural dip in Roman's cloak that seemed to envelop his entire left side. She felt her knees in the agony of her frustration. Roman, please, let me try." "No," Roman smiled again. "This is the end of the road for me. You must go on. Together. Find that tower. Stop whatever madness is going on within." Roman sucked in a labored breath, wheezing and gasping. "Promise me something. When you're done, I must beg a task of you." Edge took a step closer and knelt to hold his hand. "Anything. I'll do whatever you ask." Roman smiled again with more force this time. "I know you wish to be done with this violent world we've inherited. I know it. I see it in your eyes every time you look at her. But I must beg this of you, this one thing." "It's granted. I owe you as much." Roman nodded and paused to gather some breath. "I'm not who I led you to believe. I claim to be a servant of Hethagar and the Napoleon resistance. But I'm not." He gasped again, and Edge now knelt at his side and tried to support his slumping head. "I'm the king of the Order of the Blade. My true name is Jonathan Blade, and I have a son and a wife who will be missing me. Please, when you're done, go south. Find them. Tell them what's coming. Tell them I did my best to warn them. Through you." Edge nodded. "I will do this, Roman, I swear." "Good." Roman gathered strength from nowhere and sat up a little more to look Edge in the eye. "You're a good man, Edge Elbach. Never let your past tell you otherwise." The man they had known as Roman slumped slightly, and Edge caught him. The old man's hand snapped upward and grasped Edge's cloak with impossible strength as he gasped out one last time, never taking his eyes from Edge's face. A last wheezing exhalation came from him as Jonathan Blade struggled to get his dying breaths in and out. Edge sat with the man who had been his friend, a true friend, as he slowly faded into death. The wind swirled around them as he held his head and gripped his hand, squeezing the palm. Jonathan Blade stayed alive for some time, though he did not speak. Raymir cried silently to Edge's side, but the lost elf shed not a tear as his friend slowly passed away before him. Even as his hand went cold and limp, Edge knelt there in silence, staring at his stiff form. He only moved when the snow began to hide his friend's face, and he was beyond recognition. Then Edge stood, helping Raymir to her feet, and retrieved his halberd. The two turned silently and aligned themselves at the dark spire. Edge looked down at her and squeezed her shoulder, pulling her in tightly. Wiping her tears, Raymir gathered herself before kneeling to carefully remove the mirage necklace from around their dead friend's throat. Gently tucking it into her robe, she turned back to Edge, and they began to descend the mountain. In their grief, they did not notice amid the swirling snow the torn and tattered pages in an unrecognizable language fluttering about them, carrying their madness off to the emptiness of the frozen reach. Diaga had been in a dreamless sleep for nearly 20 hours before he had woken in the caverns, a situation he'd not experienced since he was deep in training in Osmandius. The feeling of coming out of such a state was always slow and broken, like scattered thoughts flashing through his mind. In the days since that first awakening, the fogginess had come upon him a few times once again. When rising from the brief respites, the group took on their long, dark journey. Diaga would not even open his eyes at first, but simply clutch his withered staff, running his fingers over the intricately etched runes. The staff was the one gift that he had accepted during his training, an ornate and delicate wood encased in thin metal with strange symbols. Only about a quarter of them did he know or understand, but those he did had proven useful in time. One helped to dispel illusions, and in turn remove the foggy feeling in his head brought on from arcane exertion, if he only used a small amount of magic to power it. Now amid the strange dwarves of Sunhall, he stroked this same rune with his thumb. Something about this place and the odd plants he had found had made him feel foggy. The soft glow cleared his head, and his eyes began to see the world around him more vividly. Diaga sat beside Ghost at the long table, now laden with strange food, and felt his senses come through more sharply than before. The dwarves had been oddly insistent that the famished travelers wait until all was prepared before dining, perhaps a custom that was native to their kind. Ghost seemed to be increasingly impatient and about to break protocol, gripping the wooden fork he had been given as tightly as he was. The Napoleon was not paying him any mind, so Diago reached within himself and scanned the scene about him, hoping to obtain greater understanding of what made him so uncomfortable about this place. The rest were nearby, seated and talking or laughing with one another, and the survivors from Delmore. Diago could clearly see his friends and allies, but the shapes that were continuing to haul food to them were oddly blurred, as though they were underwater. Diago shook his head and looked down at his staff, thinking he might be touching the wrong rune. It was not, and it glowed and filled him with a familiar warmth, but the blurriness was still there as he looked at the dwarves about him. Sitting up, suddenly concerned, he dug deeper and projected his strength inward to enhance the spell. The images sharpened at once, and Diago saw the horror all around them. He shoved himself up from the bench, knocking much of the food to the ground and startling those near him as he shouted, "Do not eat the food! Get away from them! Get away!" The entire multitude turned and looked at him in confusion. Neep rushed over in bewilderment, with weapons drawn, as Jovan strained up from his seat on the other side of Ghost and limped quickly towards his suddenly distraught friend. The young man tried to calm the mage. "It's all right, Diaga. Trem spoke to the dwarves already. They mean us no harm." But Diaga shoved him away and swept the rest of the food nearest him clear of the table. "They are no dwarves. They're sliths, lizardkin, shapeshifters. Get clear of them. They're sworn to Balthazar the betrayer. They mean us harm." The crowd of villagers was perplexed, and Ghost snorted in disbelief, but he halted the forkful of food before his grizzled face. Logan stood atop one of the benches, his arms held high, intending to try and calm everyone down when he spotted one of the dwarves' hands stealing into his armor. He glanced about and saw they were closing in, all reaching for knives or swords kept hidden under their clothes. Logan pulled his own blade free and smashed the table before him in two, dashing the food atop it to the ground. "Ambush! We are deceived!" Chaos ensued almost immediately. The people of Delmore grabbed their children and hurried back toward the cave wall in a mad rush. Logan and Grimtooth hurled the pieces of the table towards the now revealed sliths. They were disgusting creatures, large, moistened monsters with dark skin and bright stripes or spots all across their hideous bodies, which were some cross of reptile and amphibian. They had lidless eyes of white and mouths of thousands of tiny sharp teeth. They hissed like snakes as they approached, clad in loincloths and bearing the crude weapons they had held as dwarves. The panic among the refugees was escalating quickly, and threatened to doom them all if a plan was not formulated swiftly. Jovanileth and Diaga rushed to Logan's side to be joined by Ghost. "We have to get the people to the surface if we can." "I know," Logan shouted. "How would you propose we do that, Napoleon? We don't have a guide." "Wrath is gone too. We haven't seen him since Trem went to meet their king," Jovan chimed in. Ghost swiped at one of the creatures that had gotten too daring for his liking and drove it back. The thing hissed more loudly than before and gathered itself to spring at him. There has to be at least 100 of them. They must have killed the dwarves that lived here and taken over. Diaga gripped his staff. "Some time ago, no doubt. There are too many of them here. They have had time to spawn more of their kind." The mage looked up instinctively and cursed loudly. "There are far more than a few hundred." The others followed his eyes and unthinkingly stepped backward. The roof and walls of the cavern writhed with soft, fleshy bodies as they moved to close in on them. Grimtooth hurled an axe into the crowd of lizardkin before him and was rewarded with a screech of pain. "I think we need to stop worrying about how they got here and figure out how we be leaving." Logan nodded in agreement, but it was Jovan who spoke up. "There was a shaft, left of the one we came through here. Trem said he smelled the outdoors, but Gend told him we should stop here first." Realization dawned on the young man from Bladeholm. "Do you think Gend?" "Not important now," Logan snapped. "If there's a way out, we need to get there before they cut us off." Logan shoved Diaga back towards the corkscrew ramp. "Take the mage, get the people clear, and we will follow as soon as we can." Diaga hesitated. "But I can help. You could use—" "Now," Logan shouted furiously. "Take them now. We'll buy you time as much as we can." Diaga still did not move, seeing the increasingly larger horde of sliths now crawling out of holes in the floor and walls of the cave. There had to be thousands of them, massing to strike. Ghost grabbed him, warning Neep off with the glare. "You might be the only one of us that gets out of here, boy. Move." Diaga turned and ran, calling to the crowd behind him. "With me. We're leaving. Forget the horses and wagons. Cut the beasts loose and let them run behind or ahead. But we must go now." In a great mass of terror, the people followed as Diaga ducked into the tunnel they had come from. He urged them up once he reached a few hundred feet on the winding ramp. As the others passed, he repeated instructions. "Go to the place where the paths fork and take the center tunnel. It leads outside. Quickly." The great rush of humanity was horrible to behold. Families carrying their children rushed upward and pressed against the old and infirm. Many fell and were trampled, though some tried to help the fallen rise. Amid the rush, Neep protected Diaga from the swarm of fleeing bodies as he tried to calm the mad flight from the cavern. Through the storm of men and women, Diaga spotted Samuel, Nawandel, and Caliandra, who spared him a fleeting and frightened glance before being swept along with the rest of the crowd. Diaga nearly went after them, but resolved to stay and wait until all had passed him. Once the last few moved towards the fork, he followed and cut loose the reins of the horses and oxen behind them, slapping the beasts' hindquarters to urge them out of the caves. The animals belonging to his companions below he led on himself, shouting to those in front of him, "Do not stop, not until you're under the sky. Keep going." Diaga's voice faded as it passed down the tunnel into the deadly cavern. His friends within were now quite surrounded. At first they had tried to leave themselves some way out, but they had been forced to cut off the slits trying to pursue the fleeing refugees. Pushing back, the lizardkin stretched their line, and once the last person had made it to the tunnel, they had quickly compacted to avoid being overrun, but had allowed the slits to move between them and the exit. They could not even see the tunnel opening now. Logan kicked the body of a slith he'd slain towards the milling crowd. They had not yet tried a concerted assault, but he did not see how the defenders were to survive once they did. Ghost had his shoulder pressed against that of the knight and grunted. If we charge for the tunnel, we might break through, but we'll be leaving our backs open and leading them right to the refugees. Joven swung his torch towards the creeping shapes nearest him. They don't like the light of the fire. Maybe sunlight will be too much for them. Grimtooth chuckled humorlessly. We have no idea what time of day it be, lad. Might be running into dead of night. No chance to run. We have to fight. Maybe kill enough, and we will look like too much of a chore to be worth trying to bring down. Ghost scoffed. Nonsense, knight. Put the pieces together. What pieces are you talking about, Napoleon? Ghost finally spun to lock eyes with Logan. Driven into the caves by those shades, sealed in the tunnels, and our only deviation from our egress led through this cavern. The boy figured it out. We were being set up all along. Those two we picked up on the road meant for us to come here, and these foul creatures were waiting for us, waiting with a perfect trap for people on the run, food and shelter. They're not retreating until they've killed us, and you can be certain these lizardkin did not set up this ruse on their own. Logan's eyes widened as the truth of Ghost's words dawned on him. Then Napoleon smiled mirthlessly and turned to face the coming attack. We were betrayed, knight, and this time you can't blame me. Trem was lost in utter darkness, so impenetrable he knew it could not be natural. There were not even embers from the torches to give off a faint light he might have magnified with his powerful elven eyes. Moreover, his senses seemed dulled by the sharp pain of the metal shards in his face, hands, chest, and arms. He straightened and tried to move cautiously toward the edge of the room, seeking the walls of the chamber. A soft footstep somewhere behind him caused him to spin, his hands outstretched. Trem was certain he heard something, but the room went silent again. Then another soft pitter-patter came to his left. Trem whirled again. Who's there? A great rush of soft steps came so suddenly he could not react, and he felt a searing pain as a blade bit and cut deeply across the back of his right leg. His hamstring snapped, and he fell to one knee, screaming in agony. Trem could feel the blood pour down his leg as he howled. Where are you? Show yourself. Fight me, you coward. Balthazar, face me. The steps sped past him again, and his other leg gave out. The screaming pain tore through him once more, and now in his other limb, and Trem fell to his side, shrieking in rage and frustration. He thrashed wildly on the floor, trying to stand, trying to do anything to fight back. He heard the steps coming towards him, slowly this time, and contorted his body to face the approaching attacker. Trem still could not see. His desperation peaked, and he laughed a laugh that broke into a sob. I see, Wrath. I know you're here. I know. Come at least show yourself. Have the courage to face me when you murder me. A voice he recognized as Balthazar's came echoing off the walls of the chamber. Surrender, Trem. Join my father Naroth, and help us bind the mortal world in purpose. And let you kill the others. You think I'll let that happen? Please. Balthazar's voice was condescending. You did not return to Delmore to do the right thing. You went back out of guilt. Embrace your true self and forget the others. Begin fighting for something greater and discover the depths of your potential. Trem did not respond, his mind racing for possible solutions, and weakened as he was from loss of blood. Then a light appeared suddenly from the entrance to the chamber, its power blinding Trem for a brief instant as he lay prone and helpless on the floor. Blinking to clear his vision, he saw Wrath in the doorway of the circular room. To his shock, he could also see, standing up over him, brandishing a vicious, blood-soaked knife, was Gend, his face contorted in a strange ecstasy that rapidly turned to fear. Trem blinked again, thinking his mind was playing tricks on him. But there Gend stood, poised to end his life. The halfling looked down at him in surprise, realizing he'd been caught in the act. Rat's voice called out firmly from the entrance. Enough, Gend. I will not allow you to kill him. Gend's face warped from confusion to madness. We had a deal. He has to die. You know who I serve. Your master is misguided, Rath said, more softly this time, his voice tinged with what Trem's pain-warped mind thought might be compassion. You know this. Leave the half-elf, and do not make me kill you. Gend glanced at the shrouded figure, seeing his deadly crossbow notched with a bolt but pointed downwards. Gend seemed to consider surrender, and then he shrieked and whirled back toward the helpless Trem with his knife raised to deliver a killing blow. The bolt smashed through his back and burst out of his chest. Gend's knife clattered to the ground harmlessly as he fell to the floor. He sputtered and gasped, eyes inches from Trem's own. Fool, Wrath whispered, walking softly into the room to stand over the halfling. You know the children of Naroth keep few promises, his son Balthazar particularly. Wrath knelt beside the dying halfling and turned his head up, shining the light from his strange orb above them. I convinced you I could protect you, Gend, when I met you on the road. We were walking the same path then, but I did not know what I do now. Gend gasped, but could not speak. Wrath knelt and held his head gently. I will make this swift and painless for you. Wrath pulled a short blade from his long black cloak and dipped it in one of his pouches. He nicked the halfling's arm, and the wheezing soon stopped. Wrath then turned to Trem and pulled free another strange flask, biting off the cork and pulling the half-elf's head back. This will slow your bleeding. Drink. Trem had no chance to resist, and he nearly coughed up the ice-cold liquid, but his pain seemed to lessen, and the rush of blood slowed to a mere ooze. Wrath tossed the vial aside and placed his light orb gently on the ground as he helped Trem up, though he was still holding the majority of Trem's weight, given the severity of his injuries. They looked at one another for a moment, Wrath's face still covered in black cloth, Trem's battered and blood-flecked with jagged bits of metal lodged in his skin. Wrath spoke in a soft voice. I did not trust you, Trem Waterhound. I was here to do much the same thing that one was, but I've seen in you things I did not expect. I'm sorry I was not swift enough to stop this. The blackness of the tunnel caused me some delay, even with my light orb. Trem could not summon the words to respond. Wrath bent down and hefted him in his arms. I will carry you from here, as penance for my error, and I will take you to the city of Yulinar, that the traitor seeks. You will be doing no such thing, Wrath Ibathor Ein Elman. Trem turned his head to follow Wrath's eyes. Balthazane had reappeared by his throne. The dark god grimaced as he stepped down to the floor, covered in Trem and Gen's blood. He kicked the carcass of the halfling with a look of disappointment, and paused to stamp on the orb Wrath had set down. The torchlights had been relit, eerily illuminating Balthazane's return. Did you think I would just let you heroically retrieve him from my intricate little trap? There are thousands upon thousands of my servants outside killing your friends, Waterhound, though that damned mage managed to warn many of them of my delectable feast before they could partake. A pity, I had promised the Sliths a bloodless victory. Trem coughed and spoke with great effort. You can't touch us here, even in your own temple. You're not permitted. Balthazane stepped towards them, pausing less than an inch from Trem's face and appearing to ignore Wrath entirely. So good of you to keep up with our rules, half-elf. You're correct. However, I can affect the very stones of my domain, and with the fall of Sunhall to my servants, this entire cavern is now my temple. I hope you have not gotten too accustomed to daylight, because this will be your grave one way or another. His attention shifted to Wrath. And yours as well, assassin. You're such a disappointment, Wrath. So much hatred and violence to be controlled by some vestige of false morality within you. Have you not learned? Morality is for the weak. Wrath stared back at the immortal before him, apparently unfazed. You have no right to invoke my family name, betrayer. The god recoiled in anger, unhappy to have his threats be so obviously ineffectual, and turned sharply, putting his back to them. My father wished for me to turn you to his cause, Trem, though in truth, this is the outcome I much prefer. Welcome to your tomb. As he spoke, Balthazane disappeared, and the ground and walls began to shake and crack. Wrath hefted Trem and spun for the door. Trem grabbed his sleeve. Leave me. You can make it clear without me holding you back. Wrath glanced at him, as though considering the alternative, and then gripped his weak form tighter and rushed forward, propelling them into the hallway as stones began to fall all around them. The torches were cracking and collapsing out of the walls, and the dust and dirt had nearly filled the chamber already. Wrath was hard-pressed to stay ahead of falling debris. They flew around the corner and into the main chamber, just as a massive chunk of rock came crashing down directly above them. Joven spun and narrowly avoided a falling rock to his left. Dust flew in his face, and he hacked, choking up tiny pieces of grit that were filling the air. As he opened his eyes, he sliced the arm from a lurking slith and lurched backward, away from another collapsing chunk of debris that drove the lizardkin clear of the exit to the spiraling ramp leading upward. This time, through the cloud of stone chips all around him, he caught sight of a swirling black cloak across the cavern. Joven strained his eyes and thought he made out a streak of forest green cloth in the distance as well, and then the ceiling collapsed upon the figures and he lost them. He began to lunge forward, but something caught him by the arm and yanked him back. Jovanileth struggled, but received a hard smack to the face, and Ghost's gray beard obscured his vision. You fool, we have a chance to flee. Now run. Joven roared unintelligibly at him and struggled to get free, but Logan was dragging him out of the cavern along with Grimtooth. Let me go, I saw something across the cave. Let me go, curse you. Logan heaved him forward and through the door. We go back, and we're good as dead. If you won't flee on your own, then Grim and I shall have to do it for you. They dragged him further even as Joven battled to get loose. Ghost rushed past them, not stopping to see if they were able to dodge the falling rock of the caves, somewhat lessened in the tunnels beyond the great cavern. Joven's struggles slowed as their progress, and the roof continued to rain down upon the three like a hellish storm. The shaking finally loosened the floor and tossed all three of them down as they reached the intersecting passages. Grimtooth hopped to his feet and grabbed Logan and Jovanileth in his massive hands, charging forward to the central path, just steps ahead of the tunnel quaking apart behind them. Diaga stood at the opening of the cavern, his feet upon an overgrown but still visible road of dirt cart tracks. The realization that he and his friends had been deceived, that this was in fact the exit they had been seeking all along, and had been so close to the trap they had walked willingly into, had struck him like a physical blow. Once the others had passed him by, and gathered themselves and the horses at a safe distance, he returned to the cavern entrance. The already suffering people of Delmore had lost more than their number in the caves, some struck by falling stone and others knocked down in their flight, unable to rise. It was unclear how many made it out, but Diaga was certain he'd seen none of his companions amid the crowd. Thus he waited and watched the mouth of the cave, internally debating the wisdom of trying to forge inward and find his friends. Neep was beside him, following his line of sight, and he could sense she would intervene if he tried to move much closer. Diaga could still feel the hemorrhaging earth beneath him, and could also sense the incredible amount of power causing the terrible heaving and roiling underground. Unable to do anything, Diaga stood there, leaning on his staff and praying, something he was not accustomed to, for he had little faith in anything except his magic and his newfound friends. Now he felt certain he was in real danger of losing them, and it brought him to a desperate reach for belief in something else. A soft hand slid into his, and Diaga opened his eyes to see the caretaker of the child, Samuel. Caliandra smiled shyly and squeezed his hand. Diaga opened his mouth to say something, flushed with joy that the priestess had escaped the chaos of the escape, but had no words he could use at that moment. She turned her eyes downward and whispered, "You fear for your friends." Diaga opened and closed his mouth a few times before saying, "Yes, I do." They stood there and watched as the tremors began to slow and grow less powerful. A final massive aftershock cracked the cavern exit, and the gaping maw caved inward with a deafening groan. Diaga swept his robe up to shield them both from the flying dust and rock, and as the slight shaking and final vibrations began to slow and weaken, Diaga tried to will movement in the now sealed stone rubble before him. But when the rollicking and rolling earth finally settled, and he could no longer feel the magical power raging in the air, there was no sign of his friends or any movement in the once vast cavern opening. His shoulders slumped and he fought back tears while his silent companion squeezed his hand tighter and tried to comfort him. A massive crunch of grinding stone brought Diaga's eyes up. A huge boulder crashed down, and coughing and sputtering, Ghost emerged, falling more than stumbling down the debris. Carrying his blood brother, Grimtooth came rolling downward after him. The three collapsed at the bottom of the stone blockade, only to be disturbed by the disheveled and limping form of Jovanaleth, who Logan managed to catch before he landed face first on the long-forgotten road. Diaga reached them then, kneeling to make sure they were really there, really the people he'd come into the tunnels with. Ghost roughly shoved him away and continued to cough dust and wipe tiny rock particles from his great beard. Logan tried to smile, but he was too busy grimacing in pain and stiffness. Jovan slumped on the ground, a vacant look in his eyes, as he lay there staring up at the setting sun. Grimtooth seemed to be the only one capable of movement, heaving himself to his feet and trying to steady his stance. But before any of the survivors could drag themselves upward, help arrived. Caliandra was there to aid the orc with the same shy smile and little calming touches of healing hands. Yet she was not alone. The rest of the people who'd lived through the assault on Delmore were also there, offering shoulders to lean on and carrying water to their saviors. Even Ghost could not refuse the kindness of the refugees as they helped him towards their makeshift camp. Jovanaleth leaned on an assisting farmer, but halted as they were crossing into sight of horses and safety. Jovan looked back at the cavern, the fingers of dawn receding behind it as twilight came on. Jovanaleth smiled sadly at his aide and pulled his arm free. "Thank you, but I'm not ready to turn back yet." Logan exchanged a look with Diaga, and the young mage peeled himself away from his companion. "Bring us some water if you could. I don't want to be alone. I don't want him to be alone." Jovan limped painfully back to the cavern entrance and settled himself on a chunk of broken rock facing the imposing maw, now choked with dirt and stone. Diaga arrived a moment later and sat silently next to him. The two stared at the obstruction for a time without speaking, but Diaga could not contain himself. "You know, if there were one person who could survive that, it would be Trem," Jovan finished for him. "He went back for me. Even if I could not forgive him for leaving us in the first place, I should have been allowed to do the same for him." Diaga shook his head. "You would have died too. What would that have accomplished?" Jovan shrugged and brushed dirt from his leather breeches aimlessly. "We are all of us bound together somehow. I can feel it when we are together, and I believe the glue that unites us, for better or worse, is Trem. I know Ghost brought us here, but only one of our number seems to matter." Diaga nodded. "You discussed what he is, did you not?" Jovanaleth glanced sideways at the younger man. "He told us as much. Are you saying you knew everything before we entered the caverns?" Diaga laughed softly. "I'm a mage, Jovanaleth. We're supposed to study magic in all forms. I knew that there was something about Trem that was unusual. Encountering Joseph merely confirmed my suspicions. Do you think there's a reason he left the cottage for me? A reason he left his self-imposed exile to help me find my father?" Diaga shrugged. "There's true danger in thinking that you are, in some way, more important to him than anyone else. I fear for you, Jovanaleth, for I believe that your sense of loyalty, even love for Trem, will only bring you disappointment." He gestured with his staff toward the cavern. "If he does, by some miracle, come out of that devastation, you'd be wise to remain distant. Though I agree that we are all in some way bound to him through his unique existence." "And what about fate?" Jovan asked. "You wish me to stay away from him, but what if I, maybe even we, are meant to walk with him for good or ill?" "Fate," Diaga said softly. "I do believe in fate, but I would like to think it can be altered if the individual is determined enough." Jovan said nothing but sat there in quiet contemplation. Caliandra arrived with water and food, which the two watchers both took wordlessly. She and Diaga were curled up against the rock a few moments later, fast asleep. Jovan never even glanced at them, but sat methodically eating his ration of food and watching for movement in front of him. The darkness began to set in, deeper and deeper around him, but he remained still as a statue. His eyes drifted west of the mountainous caverns to the fringes of silverleaf forest. Jovan's memory reached back for that first encounter with Trem in the woods, waking in a strange home healed by a strange man who seemed to offer nothing but concern and kindness for him. It seemed ages ago. Jovanna left the blade home, far from his family and city, closed his eyes, and lowered himself to the ground so he could use the rock to keep his head up. He looked upward, then, at the night sky, now bedecked with stars, and whispered to himself, "My, oh my, how far we have come." Chapter 30. Arvadas Anglodeus was once again ruler of the Anglodaic kingdom, the most glorious nation in all Lagotia. As it should be, he was the king of a grand society, the pinnacle of its neighbors' monumental aspirations, and a shining example to the world of Tethtanir. That same Arvadas Anglodeus was also lord of a decimated, broken, and totally shattered home, a monarch ruling over a trapped and terrified populace, leader of a justified march to regain his rightful throne. It was a march that had killed innocent people in its efforts to make right what his nemesis had done wrong. Arvadas Anglodeus, the father of one broken son, with another son in exile, and grandfather to a boy who just lost his mother. In that moment, he was everything and nothing all at once. The same man sat bent under the weight of his crown in the palace throne room, holding the second day of open audiences with his people. The idea had been High Lord Arindians. He had encouraged Arvadas to allow the voices of the population of Alterlast and beyond to come before their king and speak their mind about events of late. Some came with advice for the king, others with requests or pleas for help, and many came with tears and fury over lost family members. Arvadas heard every one of them in turn with respect and diligent attention for their words, but in the listening, he felt his majesty was gone. He was just an old man in an overly large chair wearing a crown too heavy for his ancient head. The last visitor of the day concluded his request for more water to be sent to the southern farmlands, currently experiencing an unusual drought. Right behind him came High Lord Arindian in considerably cleaner robes than he'd worn a few days ago, his injured arm fully healed by the holy magic of the nation's priests. Beside him walked contrite Geladan Bwemmer, with a bowed head and wearing the clothes of a peasant. Arvadas glanced at Arindian for some sort of prompt to this unusual visit, but he received none. Bwemmer brought his eyes upward and cleared his throat before speaking slowly and with heavy concentration on his words. "My lord Arvadas, I have committed a dire crime against my kingdom and my people. I cannot excuse what I've done, nor am I going to ask that you forgive me. What I am asking, my lord, is the right to join the ranks of your army. I wish to begin again as a common soldier, preferably directly under your command." Arvadas' eyebrows climbed to his forehead as he considered the proposition before him. He looked at Arindian, who shrugged and said, "He asked for this opportunity to speak and nothing else. I believe him to be serious." Arvadas examined the overweight and aging man before him. "You are physically unfit for combat and will be targeted by every member of what is now Renan Ordland's army. You are certain this is not a clever attempt to avoid public execution or a lifetime of imprisonment by committing indirect suicide as an unready warrior on the field of battle?" Bwemmer shook his head. "I'm aiming to atone for the sins I've committed against our nation by serving it. I have the determination to see my re-entry into the army through, if you will grant me the opportunity." This seemed to satisfy the king, and Arvadas nodded. "Then it is so ordered. You will be under Renan's personal supervision. I believe he might find you useful in maintaining the organization of the army, as you have it in place now. At least you can familiarize him with the finer points. In your free time, I suggest you get yourself fit to fight." Bwemmer bowed graciously and turned to leave. At the massive doors, he paused with his hand, holding one open, and turned. "If I may ask, my lord, what happened to High Lord Hladic?" Arvadas paused as his eyes drifted to the gilded arms of his chair. "Brucius Hladic was found dead this morning. He slit his own throat with a letter opener while under house arrest. We'll be putting the archbishop in charge of the priests and rituals of our nation until a better solution can be found." Bwemmer's reaction was merely to nod and depart through the massive doors. Arindian and Arvadas were left alone in the massive chamber. Fremont cleared his throat and said, "Brucius's wife is already making inroads to retain her husband's title and become High Lady Hladic in his stead, as well as appoint one of Vendau's cousins, a younger woman who maintains the trade policies of Trinilith Port, to his open position. While Bwemmer willingly passed his title on, I suspect he'll be hard-pressed to keep those two from claiming other vacancies." Arvadas did not respond, and Arindian could not be certain he'd even heard him. The younger High Lord made no attempt to spark further conversation with his king, instead strolling among the pillars and hanging tapestries depicting the history of Anglodeus, finally restored after the removal of Vendau's personal banners that had dominated the hall in his brief reign. As he walked, he spoke loud enough for Arvadas to hear, but it sounded as though he were talking to himself. "In all our glorious history, we seem to be perpetually ignorant of the dark times that caused us to rise up in such vigorous defense of the virtues we built the kingdom upon. For every noble act there was a villainous deed that prompted it. Even the stones of this palace seem to rest upon the very foundations of a most nefarious race come before us. Arvadus sighed. Do you mean to imply that in our darkest hours we have always risen to our greatest heights? Erindian paused in his examination to glance at his world-weary friend. I was just making a casual observation. The silence lingered a few moments longer as Erindian left the tapestries and walked over to Arvadus. He laid a gentle hand on his back and remained there, unspeaking in the hall. Arvadus straightened a few moments later and rose stiffly. The king wore none of the gaudy robes his foe had, but his back bent as though he carried a long train made of lead. Arvadus rubbed his hands over his simple gray tunic and stepped down from the small dais to the carpeted floor. Erindian fell in next to him. A good thing Vendile did not have the gall to destroy these fine works. The hall would not have been the same without them. Arvadus still said nothing as they crossed the hall and exited through the massive main doors. He still did not speak as they made their way through the foyer and down into the outer stairs in the cool night air. Arvadus paused once they were outside as the horrors of those same steps came back to haunt him. Erindian moved to comfort his friend, but Arvadus started down the stairs before he could. Are Zarinth and Galden prepared to take on the responsibilities of the High Lords we've lost? I believe their youth can be compensated for with their enthusiasm and faith in you. As I said, Haladic's wife intends to lay claim to her deceased husband's title. I do not think we have strong enough evidence to refute her. Nothing indicates she was involved in his alliance with Vendile. She has every right to the position. I will hear her out, though I know nothing of this supposed cousin of Vendile's in Trinilith Port. Still, we must have a council, and any with relation to Vendile have the most deserving claim. Appointing Renan to a High Lord position was a stretch itself, given he's not highborn. This may be a concession that must be made to appease the established nobility. Arvadus continued down the steps and into the street, striding purposefully along the Zenith Road. Erindian continued his assessment unprompted. We still cannot find Freyan. It's believed he escaped during the commotion. Renan and Calavar have managed to gather all the able-bodied soldiers and paladins they could, and they seem to think that if we assemble our strength, will come up with a solution for the fortress currently sealing our egress through the pillars of light. Personally, I think it is going to take more brains than brawn, but they are the military men, and it's a wartime operation. There was no response from his friend, and as they reached one of the stairwells leading down the main district of the city, Erindian knew he needed to leave the Zenith Road and descend to the streets, where he would be facing a long walk to his own home. The High Lord stopped and waited, expecting Arvadus to speak with him again before they parted ways, but the king continued to walk onward, as though Erindian were not there. The High Lord watched him go, his hand slipping into his robes and finding the thin chain and odd pendant. He pulled them both free and examined them in the faint torchlight of the streets. Erindian had discovered the item while searching Vendile's quarters in the palace, and something had compelled him to take it for himself. His eyes lingered on the metal and strange dark stones a moment longer, and then he returned the medallion and chain to his pocket, went to the steps, and descended to the streets below. Arvadus walked in silence for some time, watching the light of the moon reflect off the cobblestones beneath his boots. When he too took one of the stairs nearest his home, he found the houses, finely made and well kept by the people, his people, loomed above him like judging hosts. Arvadus moved determinedly forward, trying to ignore the pressing demand he felt them heaping upon him. But they were not really the ones piling the weight on his shoulders, and there was no way he knew to shed a demon he could not see nor sink a blade into. His guilt was a monster that he could not slay. Arvadus arrived at his door to see Graham standing guard, alone. Arvadus received a formal salute, something Graham had not done for decades, and a curt nod. Arvadus made no move to the door, but stood in front of the old guard. You were not needed tonight, Graham. Derek's funeral was this evening. Graham snorted. You did not deign to abandon your duty for Elena's burial, and I saw no reason to ignore mine. Arvadus sighed. Old friend, I'm sorry for what pain I've caused you. Graham slammed his spear onto the ground, and stepped so close he was practically on top of Arvadus. He addressed him sternly. That is precisely the problem, my lord. Your sorrow is what causes the bile to rise in my throat. It's what keeps the mourning clothes on your people. It keeps your son within that house, drinking himself to death. You are a king, my lord. You make decisions as a king that cost people their lives. These people know that, and they accept it, but not when they see you doubting your own conclusions. One would almost think you wish you had left Vendile on the throne. Arvadus met the old guard's glare with his own stony eyes, but that did not halt his tirade. Derek was like a son to me. He's the only person I ever grew close to outside of your family, and his sacrifice was his choice. Through his unwavering sense of duty, he won you back your kingdom. That is our job. Our lives for yours and your causes. We accept the price we are to pay, and why can you not do the same? I did not ask anyone to die for me. And yet Derek did because he believed you will be the one to see us through this dark time. Graham laid his hand on Arvadus' shoulder. You carry the weight of our people, I know, but you must not show how heavy it becomes. You lost a potential child in this conflict. Do not lose the son who stood by you throughout it. Arvadus met Graham's eyes again and saw the plea and the hope resting within them. He nodded with all the determination he could muster, and went to his door. Arvadus swept inside and surveyed the scene before him. Maps were still spread about the central table, and a compass and quill pot lay near them. The table chairs were all leaning against the wall to his right, and in the massive armchairs before a raging fire he could see his son, back to the stairs leading to the second floor, sitting shirtless, with his staff propped between his legs and a massive bottle of black rum in one hand. He took a hard pull from the bottle and set it down on the arm of his chair, his eyes never leaving the raging fire that had turned the room into a sauna. Arvadas walked over and threw some dirt to quell the flames a bit before sitting in the chair next to his eldest. He extended his arm and Verasho handed him the bottle. Arvadas took a long sip and coughed. "This is as awful as I remember it." Verasho did not move. "It begins to taste better after you sit here long enough." Arvadas took another drink and coughed again. "It seems to me it must take quite a while." "Yes, I've sat here most of the day." Arvadas handed the jug back and turned to his son. "You could not have saved her, Verasho." The younger man snorted and drank again. When he put the bottle down, he turned his tear-stained eyes to his father. "Oh, but I could have. I could have stopped her so many times. I'm the one who allowed her to go inside, Verasho. And I was the one who tried and failed to protect her, father." Verasho shook his head, and his hair, soaked with sweat from the heat of the fire, stuck to his brow. He brushed it back and gazed into the licking flames. "I sent my brother away from his home, and I failed to protect the woman he loved. His son will grow up without a mother because of me." Arvadas leaned forward and grabbed his forearm. "You went by the code. You did what our ancestors taught us was right." Verasho hurled the bottle into the flames, and the fire shot outward before roaring furiously back into the stone fireplace. "I forsake the code. I beat that bastard's head into the marble until it was nothing more than a bloody smear, and I enjoyed it. I wish I could do it again 1,000 times over, but I also know, that it was my own head I was bludgeoning in that senseless rage. For all the harm I caused, no amount of devotion to the order I believed in so strongly could ever erase the guilt from my soul, nor wash the blood from my hands. Verasho, for the code or not, you did what you thought was right." The prince slumped into his chair and bowed his head. Arvadas rose and leaned over the chair to hug his son. "My boy, you've done more for me and our people than you can imagine. For whatever mistakes you think you've made, you have more than atoned, even if you refuse to believe so." Verasho patted his father on the head gently. "Be quiet when you go upstairs. Logan's asleep in his father's room. It took some time to get him to bed." Arvadas released his embrace and walked slowly up the stairs. He passed the same beaten shields of his forebears he'd examined over a week ago. Arvadas again lingered to consider the men who had borne them for their kingdom. Was Arindian right? Did the greatest heroes of Anglo-Daix rise from the ashes of misfortune like this? He prayed they did. He paused at Logan's room to check on his grandson, fast asleep in his father's bed. Arvadas watched him doze a few moments and then closed the door slowly, making his way to his own room at the end of the hall. Once inside, he undid his tunic and slipped on a thin nightshirt. He sat at the edge of his bed and considered the fate of his people for one last moment before turning his thoughts to his immediate family. Somewhere Logan was wandering the world with his erstwhile companion Grimtooth, unaware of the terrible things that had befallen those he loved. At that moment his father envied him on his adventures, sleeping under the stars and watching out only for himself. He hoped his son was well and without care for that evening at least, for he dreaded what his return home would bring. Arvadas glanced at the head of his bed to his wife's portrait. She had died when Verasho was very young as his grandson Logan was now, giving birth to her second child. Her death had left him with only his 2 children and the adopted orc to keep him whole, and with their love Arvadas had survived. That his own son would have to deal with that same pain did not please him. How he had wished for better days for his offspring. His door creaked open, and he saw Logan standing there in the faint candlelight, rubbing sleeping eyes. Arvadas rose and went to him, kneeling to rub his hair gently. "Can't sleep, little one." The child sniffed. "I miss Mommy." Arvadas picked him up and carried him to bed. "I do too, child. She's still watching you, you know, and I think she would want you to be happy. She loved you, Logan." "Grandpa, will my father ever come home?" Arvadas pulled the covers of his bed up to nestle Logan's shoulders before lying down atop them, beside his grandson. "If I know your father, Logan, he's on his way home right now." Logan nodded, then said sleepily, "Please tell Uncle Verasho not to cry, Grandpa. I don't think Mother would want him crying." Arvadas watched as Logan slipped off and whispered quietly, "No, Logan, I do not think she would." On the first floor, Verasho was still slumped in his chair, now with a fresh bottle of black rum to work on. He was having trouble focusing on the dancing flames in front of him. There seemed to be images in them he could not quite make out. At times he thought he wavered between sleep and wakefulness, but it was impossible to tell. Even in his dreams he saw only the fire before him. He took a big swig from his newest jug to dull his senses further, and looked to his right at the empty chair, only to see Lena sitting there in a white dress. Verasho did not move or cry out, but simply stared and laughed. "You're not Lena Engrove. I must be too deep in my cups." The figure did not say anything, but simply stared back at him. Verasho scratched his chin and shook his head in an attempt to clear it. She was still sitting there. The prince reconsidered. Maybe he had not drunk enough. He closed his eyes and took another long, painful drink, and when he opened them, Lena was standing in front of him. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he cried, "What? I'm sorry I failed you. Are you to haunt me now for the rest of my years? Do you not think my own shame will be enough of a burden? That the betrayal of my brother will not sting me as deeply as I deserve?" Still the spectre said nothing, but she bent down and kissed Verasha gently on the forehead, and brushed her hand across his cheek. Verasha awoke suddenly, in the same position he had been when Lena had kissed him. His hand stole to his forehead. The touch had felt so real, and he held his fingers to his face, a feeling of total calm kept coming over him. Verasha set his bottle down and stood, the haze of drunkenness seeming to have vanished from his body. He brushed his forehead once more in disbelief, and then threw down dirt in from the sack by the fire to quench it entirely. Turning slowly, he walked up the stairs and found his father and Logan sleeping peacefully in his parents' room. Shutting the door, he turned and walked into his brother's bedroom. Holding on to the bedpost, with his fingers running over the initials of his brother, himself, and Lena in the fine wood, he broke down and sobbed fiercely at last, no longer fighting to hold back. Verasha sank to the floor slowly, and eventually, when his sorrow could sustain him no longer, he slept. The massive stone cavern remained silent despite the staring protestations of Javanaleth. Night had completely fallen at last. The western edge of Silverleaf climbed up into the edges of the cave, thinning as the trees went higher. The woods were quiet, as were the mountains they were rubbing up against in timeless contention. The incredible lack of sound was lulling Joven to sleep, but he fought against rest viciously. Even though he could not will Trem to come out undaunted from beyond the wall of stone, he refused to turn his back on him and believe all was lost. For the others, it might be easier to accept the death of the half-elf and move on, but for Javanaleth it was not so simple. He did not understand Trem, did not think he ever could, really, but he felt a duty to him he could not explain. It was not that Trem was unique. His heritage was incredible, to be sure, but he had not been what initially made Joven feel a kinship with him. For all of Diaga's warnings, to abandon him now would be betraying that first moment of empathy between them. Joven did not think he would ever feel the same trust he had when he first met Trem, but he might be able to resurrect some of that companionship. Thus he sat and waited for any sign of hope, anything to give him the fleetest chance to rekindle the bond. Dust fell from the blockaded entrance. Joven's eyes followed the movement, but the sudden feeling of elation was no longer rising in his chest. He'd seen small rivulets of sand and stone coming from the wall before, and it had meant nothing. A larger chunk fell and broke on the remnants of the road, and then another. Javanaleth sat up and strained his eyes. More rock fell, and he thought he could hear the sound of clanging steel on stone. Joven lifted himself to his feet and limped forward. A black-gloved hand suddenly protruded from the earthen wall, and he spun to shake Diaga. Get up! Get up! Someone's coming through the rubble." Diaga took a moment to rouse, and Joven did not wait for him. The mage rose and helped Caliandra stand before trotting after the young man from Bladeholm. Joven had reached the wall and was tearing at the rock and loose stone near the extended arm in an attempt to widen the hole. He was yelling for Trem, but there was no response coming from the other side. The hole opened up quickly, and the arm disappeared. As Diaga reached the digging Javanaleth, a form was shoved through the gap in the pile of stone and dirt. Joven gasped and pulled it out. Diaga drew a sharp breath and helped him lower the bloody and mangled form of Trem. Joven knelt by him and shook his head in disbelief, horrified at the sight. What did this to him? Wrath emerged from the hole and rolled to the base of the obstruction. The young woman rushed to help him, but the mysterious outsider waved her off. The god Balthazar did that, young prince. He broke Waterhound's blade and had Gend rend his flesh so he could not stand. You saved him, Diaga said, looking wide-eyed at the black-clad assassin now brushing dust from his clothes. You rescued Trem from Gend. Wrath made no comment, but sat leaning his head against the rock in exhaustion. Joven peeled back the torn cloth wrapped around Trem's arms. Diaga, he said softly. He has steel embedded in his arms and his face. Wrath, how much blood has he lost? The dark-clad man shook his head in uncertainty. I gave him one of my potions to slow the bleeding and covered his wounds as best I could, but I'm sorry. It took a long time to dig our way free, and I had twice the weight to carry. Joven awkwardly extended his hand and patted Wrath on the shoulder. You did well, Wrath. Thank you. The assassin seemed taken aback, but recovered his composure quickly. He looked at the young mage. Can you not heal him, wizard? Diaga shook his head. I could mend some of his injuries if we remove the metal from the flesh, but he'll not walk again without powerful magical aid, and it will have to come soon. Joven knelt by Trem's head and grabbed his shoulders. Help me, Wrath. We have to carry him back to the camp. If we cauterize the wounds, then they won't bleed if the steel's pulled out. That way Diaga and Caliandra can focus on healing his legs. The two hefted Trem's limp form and began carrying him towards the encampment as fast as they dared. Diaga stood and watched a moment before a soft hand slid into his arm. Do you think we can heal him? Diaga looked at Caliandra and shook his head doubtfully. Healing isn't my specialty. My studies were always focused on ruination magic, and it was my strength as a student of the arcane. I can do some good to the outer skin, halt the bleeding in the worst spots, but to repair the massive damage to the deeper parts of his legs, it's just beyond me. Her dark eyes searched his. I believe together we can do more than just patch him up. Diaga smiled. Your faith is appreciated. He paused and considered her. You've been so welcoming and friendly towards me, and I must admit I don't understand why. The others played a great role in saving you and the people of Delmore. I was only responsible for some rather theatrical explosions. She turned her eyes down and said softly, I watched you with the others. They are aware of their strength and prowess. Indeed, they identify with it as a measure of their worth. And you, unlike them, are wary of your gifts. I admire humility and vigilance in people, and in you especially. Dagger finally dared to put his arm around her and was delighted to have her accept such closeness willingly. They started after the others together. Your words are very flattering, Caliandra. They reached the camp where the others had already woken. Neep joined Diaga and Caliandra as they passed the border of the camp. The Firecat had been resting and watching over Diaga from afar all evening. Logan helped move Trem near the fire and knelt beside Javandalath as he tried to make him comfortable. Grimtooth was turning a hot iron in the flames while Ghost grimaced just outside the light. Someone will have to hold him. He's going to thrash once that poker touches his skin. Caliandra brought a bowl and a skin of fresh water with a cloth. Joven glanced at Logan. Have you done this before? I've seen it done, but never actually been a part of it. This sort of procedure is rare in the Angudaic armies. We usually have priests nearby during battles. I can do it. Logan looked up at Grimtooth. When did you ever cauterize a wounded man? The orc shrugged, remarking, It didn't even seem to be so much about experience as being determined. I'll pull the metal free if yon lass will clean the wounds. Caliandra nodded, and Grimtooth gestured for Logan and Joven to hold Trem's limbs down. The orc reached out and pulled a large piece of steel free from Trem's forehead, dropping it into the bowl. Caliandra wiped the blood free, and then Grimtooth took the hot iron from Ghost and pressed it to the wound. Trem's eyes snapped open, and he screamed in pain, but Joven and Logan held him down. Grimtooth wasted no time, pulling the other large piece of metal from his cheek and searing the wound shut. He moved on to the pieces in Trem's arms, pulling dozens of shards out and burning the flesh to prevent bleeding. About halfway through the first arm, Trem stopped struggling, passing out from shock and pain. Once all the chunks of metal were out of the skin, Caliandra wiped the burned flesh again with cool water and chanted softly, praying to Endoth for the power to heal the injuries and alleviate the pain. The others watched, astounded, as the angry raised red marks of burned skin faded and white scars began to form in their place. Javandalath grimaced as he looked at Trem's broken form. Logan patted him on the shoulder as Diaga laid his hands on Trem's head and added his own magical contribution to the efforts to undo the horrible damage that had been wrought. Soft chanting could barely be heard, but as the priestess and the mage wove their individual spells, a faint glow surrounded the wounds on Trem's legs, and the blood oozing down his torn breeches receded. The effect lasted only a few moments, but when Diaga was done, he slumped against Neep, and Trem was resting more comfortably. Neep and Caliandra, less weakened than Diaga from their efforts, led the young mage over to his bedroll, and Grimtooth took the bloody bowl of metal and tossed it into the fire with a scornful look. Ghost shook his grizzled head and walked away from the scene quietly. Joven sat next to Trem and said with some hope to Logan, He seems better. He'll live, won't he? The knight glanced down and rubbed his haggard chin. I should think so. The wounds in his legs were the most serious, and Grimtooth did well cleaning the others. If he has not died by now, then we may hope that he will last a few more days, barring infection. Perhaps by then we can find someone to help us who's more gifted in the art of healing than Caliandra or Diaga. Wrath materialized out of the gloom. Knight, I can take you where you need to go. Logan looked distrustfully at the assassin before saying, I think before we follow your lead, you owe us an explanation for what happened back there. It seems clear that Gen did this to Trem, but how did you meet him, and why were you traveling with him before we met at the inn? And for that matter, were you lying in wait for us in that village on the road to Delmore? Joven expected Wrath to balk at the interrogation and wait for his curt response and subsequent withdrawal from the conversation. The intrigue of the moment brought Ghost and Grimtooth back to within range of the flames. The Napoleon's arms crossed as he awaited the shadowy figure's response. To Joven's surprise, Wrath sighed in resignation and reached up to his cowl. Undoing the tie at the base of his head that had kept his face almost entirely covered in black cloth, he slowly wound it free, revealing a dark black face that was hardly a shade lighter than his clothing. Joven gasped, and Ghost pointed at the assassin in disbelief. You're one of the Sun People, the legendary reclusives of Southron. Sun People? Asked Logan, now thoroughly confused. Ghost turned to him. The creation legends tell us that the humans of Southron were placed in the burning heat of the deserts there. It was a people under a sun so unforgiving it burned their skin black. Only the strongest survived. And, Ghost continued, stepping forward in excitement, they are the people who rule Yulinar, that same city I seek. Wrath met the eyes of the Napoleon and spoke. Yes, I am a man of the Sun People, as you call us, though we prefer to be known as Malarians, and I do hail from Yulinar. I am what my people call a Watcher, responsible for defending the borders of our lands. And as to how I met the halfling, his home lies just east of this cavern. He begged me to help him find you and kill a man named Trem Waterhound. He was a loyal servant to Balthazane and had information on where we could find his target. At the time, it was a convenient alliance, since ensuring the demise of the half-elf, touched by immortal power, was why I was sent from the Endless Sands in the first place. I did await you in the inn with Gend, and allowed him to bargain for our inclusion in your party. It was my intent to permit him to spring his trap, but at the last moment I chose to end the halfling's life instead. A stunned silence followed. Joven spoke first, his voice heavy with confusion. You rescued Trem and killed Gend. Why? Wrath met the young man's eyes. My people have taken great pains to gather knowledge of all that has been, is, and will be. The speakers, keepers, and tellers of all malaria, not only the great city you seek, convened and through their investigations concluded a great threat loomed. Trem Waterhound will, if he lives long enough, bring about the complete and total destruction of Yulinar, and possibly our people as a whole. His existence threatened everyone in our nation, and that is why I was chosen to find and kill him. That doesn't answer the question, Logan said, because you didn't kill Trem. Why? To be truthful on Godaic, I'm not sure. Rast shook his head and sat slowly on the ground, rubbing his brow. I was committed to the plan when Gend first told it to me. Lead Trem into the caverns, trap him there, but after he returned to Delmore to rescue you, Wrath looked at Javanaleth, he displayed devotion to another the likes of which I've rarely seen in people that are not my own. It gave me pause, and then the whole of that doomed town was coming through those caverns, and their deaths were not mine to bring about. Moreover, while I was sent to kill Trem Waterhound to save Yulinar, there were many in the city that believed such an action was too much interference in the flow of time and fate. I must admit that I was perhaps not as devoted to the act of execution as I should have been when I left the Endless Sands. Ghost snorted. Yet you still allowed Gen to lead us to the Slith Cave and nearly got all of us killed. Wrath glared at the older man. I did not know the nature of his trap nor the road out. We came to Lagosha another way, despite what Gen told you, through the twists and turns of the Silverleaf Forest. Gen only informed me we would be near the exit when the trap was sprung. He never told me how he meant to escape. Wrath paused reflectively. Gen was doing this to gain great power and stature in the eyes of Balthazar the betrayer. I do not think he considered anything beyond how to accomplish the deed. Logan bowed his head towards Wrath. I believe we do owe you a degree of gratitude for saving Trem, Wrath. If you can lead us to the city we are seeking, we'll be in true debt for your services. Wrath nodded in compliance. This I will do for you, knight. And more. My people possess magic even greater than the trinkets I carried with me. They will be able to heal the half-elf if we bring him to them. The city is not far from here. Jovan held up his hand. But you said your people want him dead. To save the city, no less. Why would they heal him? My people have rarely taken any action that would bring change, much less harm, to another mortal or nation. The decision to send me was one that was furiously debated in Yulinar. We do not believe ourselves above other civilizations or peoples, and I suspect that Trem, with you as his allies and his conscience, can be a great power that may save Tethtanir from a calamity that many in Yulinar fear is coming, whether he dies or not. Wrath looked up from where he had been staring at his hands in contemplation. Trem will not be safe in Yulinar, but he will be protected by those who value the greater fate of mortality over their own, and is the only place where he can be truly healed. Logan stood and extended his hand. We do owe you a large debt, Wrath. Thank you. The dark-skinned man stood and bowed slightly before receiving the arm clasp of the knight firmly. Then he turned and stalked off into the night without further remark. Logan looked down at Trem's prostrate form and ran his hand through his already graying hair. He glanced over his shoulder and locked eyes with Jovan. You should get some rest. We have a lot to do tomorrow. Javanaleth nodded and wandered off to find a place to sleep for the last few hours of the night. Ghost stuck around a moment to check on Trem's condition, and then, nodding as though to reassure himself, he saluted Logan mockingly and stomped away. Grimtooth and his blood brother remained, watching the slow breathing of their companion. Logan sat pensively, rubbing his hand across his face. He slumped near the fire. Grimtooth cocked his head, examining Logan's tired frame. He stepped a bit closer and crouched to head level, asking, You all right there, Logan? The knight picked his eyes up slowly and sighed. Oh yes, I think so, Grim. It's just a weird feeling came over me the last few hours. Feels like I lost something important, but Trem's back and alive, and all appears to be well, relatively speaking. So what could it possibly be? The orc shrugged and patted him on the back. Just the stress, I reckon. Been through a bunch lately, eh? Yes, Logan forced a smile. You're probably right. Get some rest, brother. Aye, Grimtooth smiled back. Good night, Logan. The knight sat there alone in the dark with a dying fire behind him. He flexed his hands, feeling the pain and cracking of knuckles stiff from holding a blade for so many hours. He looked down at Trem and shook his head. To have taken that much abuse and lived, what resolve he must have had. The scars, though. Logan traced a finger just above the marks on Trem's arms. So many it looked like a hellish spider web. His cloak and tunic were torn and bloody. Even the carefully placed bandages on his legs, despite the healing touch of Kaliandra, were bled through in a few spots. Logan reached to his right and hefted his sword, checking the balance instinctively. He was still feeling uneasy, and there was no one else on watch, so he decided it might as well be him. Logan laid the blade down and turned his attention back to Trem. The half-elf was writhing slightly, moaning in his sleep. Logan pulled his cloak about him and tried to cover him as best he could. When that failed, he took his own blanket from his pack and tossed it over Trem. That seemed to calm him down a bit. The knight watched him a while longer as he settled down and finally returned to a seemingly undisturbed sleep. Perhaps Grimtooth was right. The stress was merely weighing down on Logan. After all, what else could have gone wrong? Trem was back and alive, and Wrath was taking them where they needed to go. The knight kept telling himself things were as well as could be expected. but he never totally relaxed the tight grip on his sword hilt. Trem was home. He wandered up the old path, seeing his mother's roses lining the finely raked dirt his father maintained. Massive spruce trees rose out of the ground around it, but they grew slightly apart from the green grass, as though showing some unspoken respect for the pastoral beauty of that place and the quaintness of the scene. Trem wanted to skip to his home, but he restrained himself. He was a boy no longer. Those bright blue tunic, trimmed in silver, and soft deerskin moccasins were the trappings of a youth. He twirled his hunting bow instead and whistled a soft tune as his house came into view. It was not a large house, but a ramshackle cottage, a single-story structure, with a tilted fireplace, with smoke rising from it at the moment. This told Trem it would be warm and welcoming inside. The carefully stacked logs of the walls had been worn down to reveal a homely, weathered gray he found endearing, even if they looked a bit neglected. The door was painted a bright, gaudy red that made Trem smile. Such an outlandish color would be his father's idea of an impressive-looking bit of flash, though no one in town would be caught dead with such a bizarre contrast to the natural wood about it. His mother's garden was ripe with carrots, tomatoes, and all sorts of delicious plants. Trem could hear the brook babbling behind the house and longed to run to it, but he restrained himself. They'd be waiting inside. He felt no reason to keep them in suspense. Trem called out, "I'm home," and picked up his pace slightly. He tried to match his whistling to the tune of the birds and the trees around him, but found it too difficult. As he reached the door, he extended his hand towards the knob, surprised neither of his parents had come out to greet him yet. "Mother? Father?" "They're not there, Trem." The spell broke almost as abruptly. The pane of the door before Trem suddenly cracked and peeled, and the knob came off in his hand. He looked to see the shutters fallen or partially hanging on the window frames, the smoke from the chimney no longer rising, and holes with nesting birds now overrunning the roof of his home. Turning, he saw his mother's garden choked with weeds, and watched the tall grass appear to crawl into the path, squeezing it until it was barely able to be seen. His shirt faded to a filthy white with tears, his back weighed down by a ripped cloak, and his light hunting bow replaced with a battered soldier's longbow. His hip carried a sheath, but bore no blade, and he felt a strange burning sensation in his arms and face. He stumbled, falling to one knee, and his combed hair grew disheveled and matted with dirt, dropping in front of his eyes. Trem tried to brush it back, but he felt weak, and lowered his hand to steady himself. "Do not strain, Trem. Even here, your body is somewhat broken." Trem forced his head up. Curvin hovered before him like some strange specter, bright, fiery blue eyes amidst a brilliant blue cloud. Trem nearly collapsed as memory washed over him, the sword exploding, the pain in his arms and face, the slashing in his legs, wrath carrying him. All the memories flooded back, and he gasped in realization. He was alive, but not awake. "Curvin," he managed. "Where am I? Are we out of the caverns?" "Yes," the god spoke calmly. "Wrath carried you out safely. You're now in Southron, making your way to his home city, Ulinar, the same one the ghost seeks. There you will be healed of your wounds, for while Diaga and the servant of Endoth were able to save your life, they cannot completely repair the damage Gen did to you." Trem digested the flow of information. "The others, they're alive. All are well. Your determination and defiance of Balthazar cost you your weapon, a powerful tool, but spared you your life and that of your friends. Had you given in at any point, succumbed to weakness of mind or body, you would have been consumed, and they along with you." Trem considered Curvin's words as he stood with great effort. "But to what end? Balthazar was meant to kill me, break me? Then why steer me away from Delmore by imitating Garand Oakheart?" Trem steadied himself and focused his gaze on Curvin before him, seeing the dissonance on the edge of his form and the wavering in the clarity of his presence. "Stop hiding behind the masks of others, betrayer." As though he were stepping through a doorway, the finely garbed form of the god of betrayal stepped out of the illusion of Curvin, and it faded behind him. Trem stood there, the broken memory of his home around him becoming amplified. The trees drooped, and he could hear the crack of rotting wood as his home began to crumble. Trem closed his eyes and gritted his teeth. This was one of his few fond memories of life, his home before he learned it was not his home. The being before him was trying to break it. He exhaled slowly, purposefully, and tried to suppress the pain and confusion in his battle-worn mind. Trem opened his eyes. Balthazar still stood there before him, a smug smile on his face, yet the half-elf could sense he was not as self-assured as he presented himself. "Tell me," Trem said firmly. "Well," Balthazar said smoothly, "you certainly have grown more perceptive, or perhaps less trusting. I would consider both an improvement." The god folded his hands inside the arms of his robe. "But you also nearly fell to a desperate and inept servant of mine, if not for the interference of the Malarian assassin." A smooth chuckle escaped the oily goatee as Balthazar stepped off the path, breaking a rotted branch from one of the trees that now oozed with termites black as coal, and with carapaces as slick as oil. Balthazar plucked one free and crushed it in his hand. "You see, Trem, you're just like these here, easily dispatched when one wants to, but we did not want you dead just yet." Trem smirked. "You tried awfully hard to kill me for someone who wanted me alive." Balthazar thrust his chin forward. "I merely wanted to see the kind of determination you possessed, and leave you with a sign of our encounter." Trem looked down at his arms then, and the burning made sense. Long, hot, bulging scars on his arms, and he could and he could feel the same on his face. Trem ran his hands along the facial swells above his eye and along his cheek. He felt his heart grow fiery, rage boil over. You think a few scars on my skin matter to me after what all you mortals did to me? You think I care about how I look on the outside? This is how I ought to look. I welcome it. Good, Balthazar howled back, his composure broken at last. It's only the beginning, after all. Do you even understand what's at stake here? You're traipsing about with this band of misfits, worrying over petty matters, while my father and his loyal servants work to save your miserable lives. Trem spat at Balthazar. You truly live up to your title. You expect me to believe there was some form of test to turn me to your cause, and that of Neroth, by rending my body and allowing Gen to dispatch me piece by piece? Balthazar ripped another branch down and hurled it at Trem. Wise once again. No, I did want you to die. My father believes you're a being of great potential, a demigod that can rise with us to face the danger threatening your world, but I see through you. I know your past. The rage receded, and Balthazar became oddly calm and somber. I was not always the god of betrayal. I was once the god of faith, but you, his finger jutted accusingly at Trem, you and all your kind twisted the gift of mortal life and found dark corners of yourselves to bring forth in such quantities that they changed not just you, but us as well. Do you think I relish my duties? I despise them, but they are necessary. You are unwilling to embrace what you are, and to do what must be done. Yes, I would have been pleased to have you die, but in this realm perhaps I can do what Gen could not. The dreamscape spun, and Trem remembered the cautionary words of Curvin, understood the threat Balthazar posed to him, but even in his weakened state he felt a surge of immense determination. He was done running and being bullied. Trem smiled cruelly. This is my home. You're not welcome. The dreaming world shifted, spiraling and bending as Trem unmade it. Balthazar stumbled, trying to regain his footing and failing, feeling off balance and incredibly confused. He reached out, tried to step toward the half-elf, but he faltered and nearly collapsed. Balthazar found purchase for a moment and cried out, You'll learn, Waterhound. One way or another, you'll come to understand the futility of your efforts and the depths of real woe. Cursing the defiance of his foe, Balthazar relented and pulled himself out of the dream and back to his own realm. Trem relaxed his hold over the dreamscape, the effort sending him into deeper and fleeting unconsciousness. He clung to thoughts and images that moved with him as he fell out of the dream. This was his memory, not Balthazar's, not anyone's, just his. Trem would lose control of most things in his life, it seemed, but not this place, not ever. Closing his eyes, Trem stopped fighting the descent, out and away from the dream, released his memory, and floated off into a deep slumber. He was embraced in a total oblivion that was difficult to reach, unless one knew the way. Alright, Epilogue. The teeth worked, gnawing, ripping, rending. The rat and his brood tore at what was left of their rare and sumptuous meal. It had been a long time now with no fresh meat for the writhing rodents. The screaming had made the first few hours of feasting so pleasurable and exhilarating the rats had worked too quickly and gorged themselves. Now days later they worked hard for little results, grinding their incisors against bone, hoping to reach the marrow within. The rat turned away, letting his brethren continue the futile effort, and wandered down to the entrance of the cell. A light flared down the hall, and the rat froze as the illumination rolled forward, rapidly lighting and extinguishing torches bursting to life and winking out almost as quickly as a massive, dark figure came by. D'Arveron strode purposefully forward down his long hallway. He stopped at the cell door to examine the gruesomely dismembered body for a moment, and then moved to his laboratory. Once within, he scanned the room, moving across it to a large object covered in a great sheet. He pulled back the thin shroud to reveal a great opening shaped like a perfect ring of stone, the circle devoid of any carvings. It was a wonderfully symmetrical piece, but looked little more than a meager decoration. D'Arveron removed his gauntlet and waved his spectral undead hand before it. The vacuous doorway shimmered, and a portal of swirling dark water emerged, held within the frame of stone. After a few moments, one of the night cloaks appeared, standing in rippling watery mirror, held within a circle. The being bowed before him, and D'Arveron settled onto a beaten stool before the strange opening. Where are they now? The shade's otherworldly voice poured through the portal. They have passed through the caves. D'Arveron snarled. Alive, all of them. Yes. D'Arveron shot up from his seat and slammed his mortal hand onto the table. All of them. How is that possible? He did not wait for a response, but swept his undead hand across the portal frame and whirled to depart the room in a rage as the watery gateway fell in solid chunks and shattered like thin ice across the floor. D'Arveron stormed down the hallway and paused at the door to his summoning chamber. Gathering himself, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. Crawling behind him in hopes of finding more food, the rat narrowly squeezed past the closing door. Without any other place to hide in the featureless room, the rat hugged the wall of the chamber. D'Arveron entered his small circle and tossed a handful of bone dust to the floor, the wall sconces alighting with blue flame as he reached the circle. The chant took a short time, and the cloud of black smoke dissipated swiftly. Neroth made no pretense of a dramatic entrance as he materialized out of the smoke suddenly and stood before his servant. Tell me, Deravron, why did your night cloaks fail to kill any of the party before they reached the caverns? Deravron bowed. My lord, I cannot say. It seems they had the assistance of a being possessing items powered by the essence of light. He disbanded my servants before they could complete their work. The mage paused. And if I may say, my lord, another was to arrange their demise once I drove them to the caverns. I'm not the only one who failed to achieve your goals. Oh, quite the contrary. Deravron looked to his right and was shocked to see Balthazar standing there. This is impossible. I did not summon your presence. Narath waved his hand in the sign of peace. I brought him here. You've done well in your work to bridge the mortal and immortal worlds, Deravron. Now when I am in your chamber, I can manipulate much of it to my liking, and as my power grows here, I will be able to affect more and more around me. But for now, I merely wish to inform you of how damaging your incompetence has been. I had put fail-safes in place, should your gambit with the night cloaks and broken fail, Balthazar said mildly, but my servant and his ally were less reliable than I expected. Balthazar took a step forward and held out his palm, an empty vial hovering above it, which Deravron could see clearly. The Malarian knew much of your servants and how to defeat them, but nonetheless you did not fail completely. The party did enter the caves, and I met this mortal, Tremwaterhound, at last, but I was unable to turn or slay him. You were the other waiting for them in the caves, and the second target of my investigation, Waterhound, was with Greymane Squall all along. Deravron shook his head in confusion. How long have you known Trem was among them? Why threaten and cajole me to kill this party if you wanted to try turning Waterhound instead of ending his life? Balthazar sighed. I wanted Waterhound dead. He eyed his dread father askance. Others thought he might make a useful ally if properly taught through force. Deravron was having difficulty containing his anger. Why keep the truth of this mission from me? Do you doubt my abilities? The demise of the traitorous Napoleon was your goal, Narath waved his hand, preventing Deravron's protest before they began. It was important that the rest felt truly threatened, and the death of any of their number would have been fruitful. Balthazar sighed and rubbed his goatee. Yes, Greymane Squall was the only one you truly needed to eliminate. He has learned too much of Yulinar and ancient weapons that he does not need to know. His death and that of the assassin would have been useful in preventing them from seeking the Malarians at all. Deravron grew angrier still. Perhaps if I were privy to more details of my tasks, I might be able to carry out those missions more effectively. Narath stepped forward, dangerously close to Deravron. You will not forget your place. I gave you life, and I may take it away. What power you have through me alone. Deravron did not flinch, but he also was wise enough not to respond. The god of death could not stretch his will outside the confines of the circle, but the air in the room crackled as both he and his servants stared threateningly at one another across the invisible wall between them. Balthazar stepped to his father's side. This is not necessary. The half-elf is broken, and even if they reach Yulinar, the Malarians are as likely to kill him as they are to offer aid. Narath did not break his stare, nor did he draw back from Deravron. The foul wizard held one hand to his ruined face, covered in its silken wrap, and said quietly, I will serve you in whatever capacity you ask of me. Tell me what I should do next, and it will be done. There was no apology or subservience in the voice, but it seemed to satisfy Narath for the moment. He pulled back from the barrier between him and his summoner and spoke. The night cloaks are no longer needed to the south. What is done, and those striving to reach Yulinar are not your concern anymore. Even if they receive help, they are far away and weakened. By the time they discover a means to oppose my conquest, it will be too late. You, Deravron, will see to the defense of Marlpaz and assist Valissa Ulfrin and Hrothgar Conan with the war in Lagotia. As for the particulars of your mission, it is simple enough. Crush all resistance remaining on the continent and deliver it to me. I trust that is not too elusive a task for you to grasp? Deravron resisted the urge to bite back and simply bowed. It shall be done, my lord Narath. Without further comment, Narath faded before Deravron, taking his son with him. For a time, Deravron stood staring at the space where Narath had been. He was enraged and would have relished destroying the entire chamber, putting an end to the usage of its portal in his service to Narath. Had he not understood, it would have led to his demise. The furious wizard snorted in derision at his own weakness and turned to leave the room. He placed his hands on the great door and heaved it open with unnatural strength. The rat had waited patiently by the door to flee. The strange presences in the room had made it desperate to return to the brood. As the door opened, it made a break for the laboratory. A raven swept down and ripped the rat from the stone floor, carrying it into the chamber and impaling it on its beak at the center of the circle. The rat died instantly, writhing in death throes on the stone of the summoning chamber. Deravron let the door go and spun toward the bird, yelling in disgust. Damn it, Freyan, I told you not to practice that foul habit in my presence. The raven shifted and grew into the broken advisor, who wiped blood from his mouth with a sly smile. I apologize, Deravron. It is my nature. Deravron regained his composure, but shook his head in irritation. Your nature aside, please refrain from doing that in my chamber. Freyan smiled. As you wish. The strange visitor cocked his head at the mage. Did your meeting not go so well? Deravron crossed his arms. I'm not a mere apprentice, nor am I a fool. I should know the implications of what I'm doing. Freyne approached him slowly. "And you do. Our true master has been clear with us. You must continue to serve the ignorant fool in his war to cow these mortals, and when the time is right, we'll have all that should be ours. And unlike your other master, who gives you only harsh words and accusations of failure, I bring you a gift." Freyne pulled forth the tome from his robes. It was a massive book, black leather sheets stitched together at broken seams over the covers. The spine was stiffened by long bones bound together with a strange sinew of gray. On its cover, there was only a deep imprint of a smiling skull surrounded by a ring of ice. D'Arvon could not believe his eyes. He reached out slowly with both hands, and Freyne laid it carefully into them. The undead mage looked at his cohort. "Is this the book?" Freyne smiled deviously. "Would I give it to you if it was not?" D'Arvon ran his mortal hand over the cover reverently. "Am I to use this?" Freyne stepped backward, leaving D'Arvon with his prize, and nodded. "Our master says it will take time to study, but once you have the knowledge within, your power will be nearly limitless." D'Arvon met the eyes of his counterpart and smiled victoriously. "I'll begin reading immediately." The nondescript man in plain robes stepped back. "Very good. If you could open the door for me, I have places to be." D'Arvon moved to the door, but paused with his grip on the large handle. "Tell me, Freyne, where was the book?" The strange man smiled. "Within the secret royal library of the Anglo-Daix, of course." The undead mage digested this strange revelation. "Of course." D'Arvon heaved the massive door open, and Freyne's raven form flew through it and down the hall. The wizard stood at the entrance to his casting chamber and ran his hand over the book once more. He glanced back into the summoning room and sighed when he saw the corpse of the rat. D'Arvon strode over and picked up the broken form. Holding it in his palm, he examined it. A strange thought went through his mind. Balancing the heavy book in his spectral hand, he set the corpse back on the ground. He opened the tome, flipping through the pages slowly until he reached what he sought. The language was strange and archaic, but D'Arvon could read it with some care. He ran a finger underneath the writing slowly, hearing the words in his mind as he went. Once he found the part he was looking for, he stopped and read it over several times. Then he balanced the book before his eyes and held his hands over the corpse, reciting the words in a chant that grew louder and louder. The body of the rat began to glow with a strange green light and rose off the floor. D'Arvon increased the speed of his chanting, and the glow grew stronger, until it was so bright he could hardly see the rat's body. Then it winked out. Two unearthly red orbs glowed out from the floor by D'Arvon's feet. They moved side to side about the chamber, taking in the sights around them. D'Arvon smiled and snapped the book shut. He strode to the entrance and opened it, letting the torn and bloody body of the rat precede him. D'Arvon followed out into the hallway and then to the laboratory. He swept the scrolls and books from his reading desk to the floor and slammed the new tome down in their place. Opening it to the first page, he waved a hand to light the nearest wall torch as brightly as possible and sat down to read. The rat skittered back to the brood. His world had gone strangely black and then returned, but this was somehow different than it was before. Through a dim red haze, the rat watched the large figure before it, feeling a strange kinship to the form it had never shared before. The rat smelled the brood down the hallway and quickened its run towards it. They were still there, in the cell, writhing over the corpse of the dead prisoner. The rat crept in slowly, but the others smelled the change in him. They stopped the feast, and a few slowly crawled down to investigate. The first one came near the strange new rat and sniffed him. There was an unmistakable odor of death on him, and yet the rat seemed to move. The brood knew dead things did not move, yet this member of their clan was acting as though it was alive. A more curious rat crawled closer and sniffed the face of his companion. The rat, through the red haze of his new eyes, saw his family before him, but there was no sense of unity or kinship between them. Instead, the rat was overtaken with a sudden, raging hunger. The jaws of the rat opened and snapped forward, closing on the face of his curious brethren. D'Arvon smiled at his desk as he heard the shrieks of pain and horror from the rats in the cell. He stroked the pages of his book lovingly and continued to study the dark secrets within. So, that's book one. My impression right now is that my son's asleep, so I'm not going to try to get him on the stream. But the next stream will be myself and Wes Covey, who actually did an entire soundtrack for this book. And we'll be talking about the soundtrack and also doing Q&A and trying to answer some other questions. If anybody wants to send questions or has anything that they want us to talk about on that stream, they'll be coming sometime after the holidays, and you can send anything to either @LegacyChronicle on Twitter or trevorhpaul@gmail.com. Also, if you're looking to get a signed copy of Book 1 or Book 2, the newest editions, you can send a direct message either through Twitch or through YouTube, Facebook, or the aforementioned Twitter and emails. Hope everybody has a good holiday. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back with The Shield after the holiday break.